Good morning, everyone. Good evening. Good afternoon, wherever we may find you. I'm Leslie Southwick Trask, and I'm coming to you from the original territory of the Niitsitapi, the Blackfoot Confederacy. And in this morning, of afternoon or evening, I think we in North America have a new definition of what is a watch party. Many of us have gotten together to watch great sports events, the Super Bowl or American Idol or whatever that genre is that you watch. But in North America, we got to have watch parties for Vladimir Zelensky. And in Canada, as everyone gathered to watch his address in Parliament, and in the US, when his address to President Biden, there was not a dry eye in the House. Here's a man who has risen to a stage in leadership that has not been seen for many, many, many years. So in this moment of a great reckoning, of a great recognition of what leadership looks like, feels like, listens like, our dedication is to this great human and all of those that he is leading, and all of those who resonate with his call to stand for freedom. This is what we mean by the politics of being. As much as going inside and finding what is your politic of being, we can look to some great examples for what that means. But what is our own? And how do we search for meaning in discovering what our own politic of being is? In order to do that, we have to go inside. So here we are, day 434 on Humanity Rising, and we're going to start with a meditation on reflection. Who am I in this state of being? And as we move into the heart through this meditation, let us just listen in to what it has to say. Let's take a deep breath and go inside. Oh, it always feels so much better, doesn't it? Well, speaking of great leaders, I'm going to hand this over to a leader that I deeply respect, one that I get to work with every day. So I'm the lucky one. Shelley Alcorn.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you for a wonderful kickoff this morning. So this morning has presented us with some challenges, and we're very happy that you are here with us. Our guest presenter, Dr. Thomas Legrand, was going to be here speaking on the politics of being, and unfortunately, he has been detained. So as we were considering what we could bring to you, it just so happens that last week or perhaps earlier this week. The days sort of blend together for us. Dr. Jim Garrison from Ubiquity did a lecture on what I think is, along with Hannah Arendt and other writers coming in the aftermath of World War II. I think that Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl is one of the most moving works that deserves time and attention. And I can't imagine it being more timely for us to dig deep into the concepts of how do we create meaning even under the most horrible of circumstances. So Leslie and I are I'm going to share my screen and we're going to hopefully play this lecture for you. And I do hope that you're stay in the chat and ask questions. And I'll be watching the chat and seeing if I can illuminate some points for you as we go. But thank you for joining us this morning. And we do hope that you enjoy this piece, part one of Jim's lecture on Viktor Frankl's The Man's Search for Meaning.
Shelley, you don't have sound. You might try it again.
Sorry about this. I'm going to try this again.
His experiences in the concentration camps of World War II as what Barbara Tuchman would refer to as a distant mirror of our world today. You may remember her work on the bubonic plague that hit Europe in 1348 and lasted for 60 years and decimated probably a quarter of the human population from Iceland to India over and over again. It was a very debilitating experience for the world generally, I think for Europe in particular. Although out of it, as fate would have it in the mysterious workings of history, out of it came the Renaissance. And so she wrote about that experience as a distant mirror for what we're experiencing today. So it's in that spirit of Barbara Tuchman and a distant mirror that I wanted to explore the work of Viktor Frankl, because I think his insights can serve as a guide in our world. One of the truest things about what is happening is that we're all suffering. We're all suffering with what's happening in the Ukraine. We're watching a major power invade small defenseless power. We know it's being done because of certain historical factors. Russia needing a buffer on its eastern flank, the United States and NATO refusing to provide Russia that buffer. And so in 2008, when NATO declared that it was now going to absorb Ukraine and the Republic of Georgia. The Russians said this would constitute an existential threat, that they would not allow that to happen under any circumstances. And if you remember the US response to the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962, when the Russians tried to put missiles in Cuba, you get a measure of what's happening. So I want to call this topical situation out because sometimes we all get caught, as Viktor Frankl did, in the massive mega trends of history. And they cause us all to suffer. Because for reasons that are unknown, we humans seem to have almost a congenital defect around solving our challenges before they become crises. We're not very good at doing that. We have COVID still playing itself out in many parts of the world. It seems to be ebbing, but over the last 2 years, we've all suffered due to COVID because essentially we've all been under martial law. We've been under lockdowns. We've been under social distancing. We've been having to wear masks. We've been social beings unable to socialize in any meaningful way. We discovered Zoom. We tried to do it through Zoom, and we're doing it as we speak right now. And there's a certain intimacy that always emerges when humans have contact in any way, but nothing takes the place of personal contact. And if you're hit because of the pandemic. We're also in code red for the climate. We're now in a situation where all over the world, we're experiencing escalating climatic turbulence. In the news just this morning, there were pictures of videos of unbelievable flooding in southwest Australia, around Sydney. The entire cities are just, the water moved in so fast that the cars were literally floating away. And so as we look around us, I just wanted to enter into this program today in a spirit of deep empathy for the suffering that all of us are bearing witness to and experiencing as the world turns with forces bigger than we are, mostly unknown. But when they crash upon us, they can sweep us away. So how we maintain our presence of being in the maelstrom, not of our choosing, is an act of spiritual insight, and I would say moral discipline, that we're having to learn in ways we never expected before the onset of the pandemic 2 years ago. And now with climate in code red and an invasion of Ukraine. None of us saw any of this coming. And similarly, even though it's completely obvious to us today that the Nazis would rise in Germany, given the conditions that we now understand, most of the world at that time had as little idea about what was going on than Russia invading Ukraine. It was a black swan event. It's what they call a black swan event, where in hindsight, it looks absolutely inevitable, predictable. But at the time, people experience it as an astonishing disruption of normalcy. So I want to bring that aspect in too as we contemplate what's happening today, but we also contemplate what happened back in Germany as we explore the life and writings of Viktor Frankl as a distant mirror to our own, the unexpected nature of world events, which only in hindsight follow any discernible logic. Viktor Frankl was born in 1905 to a modest but successful Jewish family in Vienna. He was precocious from a very early age, and he was fascinated as an early teenager by psychiatry. He was one of those people that knew exactly what he wanted to do when he grew up. I'm still not quite sure what I want to do when I'm growing up. But he was one of those people who absolutely knew he wanted to be a doctor and he wanted to get into psychiatry. And when he was only a teenager, he was writing Sigmund Freud, who was also in Vienna. They lived in the same city together. And then he went off to the University of Vienna. When he was there, he specialized in psychological studies, and in particular, looking at suicide and depression. He was involved with Ralph Adler's group, which I'll go into in just a moment. He was expelled from that group because he didn't adhere to Adler's notion that the fundamental category was power. And little old young Viktor Frankl said, no, it's not about power. The deepest motivation of the human being is around meaning. And when he was only 21, I mean, what were you doing when you were 21, right? When he was 21, Viktor Frankl developed his whole theory on what he called logotherapy. The assertion that meaning was the fundamental category. And I want to just fill that out for a moment before we dive into the rest of the story, because it offers us a way in to who he was and a way in to how one navigates through extreme suffering. Let's start with Freud. Freud, in the end, masterful genius that he was, said that the basic impulse that humans have is around eros, around the pleasure principle, around sex, around the id, we call the id, that when we're born, we just want our, we want to eat when we want to eat, we want to do what we want to do, and we are governed exclusively by the oceanic pleasure principle. And all of a sudden we learn that that's not the way the world works. That you've got to go to the bathroom before you defecate. That if you're going to eat, you have to demonstrate certain manners. So at a very early age, Freud said, we start to be socialized through the coercive force of civilization. And that what happens is we're socialized coercively to modify our pleasure principle. We begin to develop a superego so that our conscious says, you have to drive on the right side of the road. You have to use your fork in your right hand and your knife in your left hand. Those are all functions of the superego. And that because the superego is pressing down on the pleasure principle, We just want to have pleasure all the time. We develop neuroses. And because we don't deal with them, we repress them, they start manifesting as neurotic complexes. You know, you start to have a twitch, or your arm starts to be paralyzed, or you get ill. So Freud's genius was that if you lie somebody down, you have them tell your story, you start to look into those deeper recesses of the unconscious, that you can heal. And he learned this, by the way, just so you know, how small the events are that cause the revolutions of psychology in Paris, where he was there with a doctor that was in this ward, and everybody was literally paralyzed. They had some paralysis. Some people couldn't move their arms. But what they discovered is if you put people in hypnosis and get them to talk, their arm comes down, they interact perfectly normally, and then when they're out of hypnosis, their arm becomes paralyzed again. And that insight of Freud's was the genesis of psychoanalysis. One of his students was Adler. And Adler said, no, I think that's a factor, but if you look at human beings, they're always in power relationships. Even the baby and the mother, it's a power relationship. I want to be fed. No, you can't be fed. And that as we get older, we refine the instrumentality of how we exert power over others. And that power, if you looked at Lord of the Rings, is the corrosive element in human relationships. And because of power differentials, women under men, nature under humanity, the colonializers and the colonized, racial domination. It's all power relationships, according to Adler. So it's not about pleasure. It's about how we adjudicate, understand, and solve the problems of power. Jung had a different idea. For Jung, it was the issue of spiritual development, of one's individuation process, as one comes into a relationship with the archetypes that come out of the unconscious to shape conscious behavior and attitudes. And so for Freud, for example, to be religious was a sign of a neurotic symptom. And for Jung, to be religious was not a neurotic symptom. It was the pathway to individuation. So the spiritual and religious dimension for Jung, the self, the totality of the psyche, that is what was most important in human development. And it was Jung who was the first one to understand that this isn't just, happened in Jim's life, but I'm a mere flotsam in the river of time. And I carry in my psyche, ultimately, all the memories of the entire universe, since the Big Bang. And that's what makes, according to Jung, life so complex. Well, little old Viktor Frankl, in his early 20s, said, I have another idea. I don't think it's about pleasure or power or religion. I think it's about meaning. And it's not some thing out of my unconscious. It's about how I interact with the circumstances in which I find myself. And we're going to go into the formal aspects of logotherapy next lecture. And I want to now dwell on his life and his book in this lecture. But I just wanted to frame as we begin our contemplation of Viktor Frankl, where he, from a very early age, began to demarcate himself in the burgeoning field of psychoanalysis, psychology, psychotherapy. He was actually one of the founders of that whole domain, along with these other giants. It very quickly, he started to work in the neurology department in a major hospital in Vienna. Then he had to switch hospitals because with the rise of Nazism, certain hospitals said that Jews could not have, staff positions. So he had to move to a hospital. And then in 1942, when he was 38 years old, he was sent to the camps. He had just been married. His wife was pregnant. They were forced to have an abortion. I want to bring this in because just imagine, just married. Your wife is pregnant. And then all of a sudden, a house comes down. There's an invasion. There's a pandemic. In this case, there's the Nazis. And all of a sudden, your normal life as a successful psychiatrist, motivated 100% to help people, all of a sudden you realize that because you happen to be Jewish, you're taking it in the teeth. Not because of anything you did. You never broke a law, but just simply because of your racial identity, which is hard to take in. In the book, he recounts that because of his fame, he was offered the opportunity to leave. And he had an experience at his father's house, which is worth detailing. His parents were old. They were failing. He knew that to leave them would be to leave them to a fate that at that moment he did not know, but he knew enough to know it would be bad. But he had his own life. He had a wife, child on the way. He was seeing the handwriting on the wall. He went over to his father's house and he noted a little sherd on the table. And he asked his father what that was. And he says, oh, that was something that came out of a synagogue that was burnt and torn down by the Nazis. And he looked at it and it was part of the 10 Commandments. And it happened to be the 6th commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. And when he read that, in that instant, Viktor Frankl knew he could not abandon his parents. Now that's an act of such nobility, everyone. It's such honor that we all should just pause and take in the gravity of that act of magnanimity in that moment. And that's when one's character is revealed for everything that it is. So he went consciously to the concentration and extermination camps with his family, knowing he could have escaped. But going through the path of deeper meaning. Make a long story very short, because I want to get into some of the issues that he deals with in his book. His father, his mother, his brother were gassed. His wife died of typhus at Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Viktor Frankl himself was in 4 different camps in 3 years. His sister managed to escape from Auschwitz. I don't know the details. And then as the Russians advanced in the spring of 1945 and around May of 1945, he found himself liberated, and he went back to Vienna. And one of the first things that he did was enroll in a PhD program. He got his PhD on the subject of what he called the unconscious God, looking at the role of religion in the domain of suffering. And then in 1946, in only 9 days, he wrote Man's Search for Meaning, where he chronicled those salient moments in his experience in those 4 concentration camps, out of which he came to understand the power of meaning in the context of unexplainable, completely irrational suffering. So I want to dig in and read some passion portions out of his work that enable us to, through his own experiences, fathom the profundity of the teachings that became his corpus in logotherapy. Although Man's Search for Meaning was his first book, he ultimately wrote 39 other books and died at a ripe old age in his 90s. I think he was 93, 94 in 1997. So that's the life of Viktor Frankl. What I want to tease out in this lecture today is the essential point that he makes, that it was possible for spiritual life to deepen even in a concentration camp. And that's really important. You know, as we look around the world today, we say, you know, and I say often, this is complete madness. How can, I mean, what's going on? Who's in charge here? Why does it keep getting worse and worse? And that reaction to circumstances we don't understand and over which we have essentially no control creates a powerlessness and, as Frankl noted, a cynicism and despair that can break our health and terminate our lives. So how we're responding to what's going on is the critical element in our health, our well-being, and in our capacity to create the kind of meaning we need in order to flourish. And if you can flourish even in a concentration camp, you can flourish anywhere. And that's what Viktor Frankl did, by understanding that no matter what your context, there's a spiritual thread, there's an Ariadne's thread that if you find it and you follow it, leads to a transformation of your own soul, as a result of which you can endure anything, even death itself, with dignity, with nobility, with compassion. That's the fundamental insight of Viktor Frankl out of Auschwitz. So I want to just read a few paragraphs and comment as we go along, because it's such rich material, and I urge all of you to read it, those of you who haven't, because it is just sublime. But he talks about the ceaseless marches, getting up in the freezing dark before dawn and marching, and the shoes don't fit, and there's pus and edema, and which is sort of swelling of your limbs because you're starving, and 9 men in the a bed, which isn't even a bed, it's just boards, and the urine and the feces and the snoring and the sickness and the foulness of the air and the groans, and you get up and you got to work for 12 hours, and they're trying to work you to death. That was the point. To starve you and work you to death. And that's what you got to work through. So we stumbled on in the darkness, over big stones and through large puddles along the one road leading from the camp. The accompanying guards kept shouting at us and driving us with the butts of their rifles. Anyone with very sore feet supported himself on his neighbor's arm. Hardly a word was spoken. The icy wind did not encourage talk. Hiding his mouth behind his upturned collar, a man marching next to me whispered suddenly, "If our wives could see us now. I do hope they're better off in their camps and don't know what is happening to us." This brought thoughts of my own life to mind. My mind clung to my wife's image, imagining it with uncanny acuteness. I heard her answering me. I saw her smile with frank and encouraging look. Real or not, in that moment, her look was then more luminous than the sun which was beginning to rise. A thought transfixed me. For the first time in my life, I saw the truth as it is set in the song by so many poets, proclaimed as the final wisdom by so many thinkers. The truth that love is the ultimate and highest goal to which man can aspire. The salvation of man is through love and in love. I suddenly understood how a man who has nothing left in this world still may know bliss, be it only for a brief moment, in the contemplation of his beloved. Who is your beloved? It was Rabia, actually, the Muslim mystic of the 8th century in Saudi Arabia, Syria, Middle East, who first coined the term beloved in discourse about God. That term didn't exist. It was never used in all of history about God until Rabia, a woman mystic, one of the original Sufis. The beloved. Rumi spoke about the beloved. In that cold morning, Viktor Frankl had an epiphany that love was absolute, and that one's beloved was a gateway to the love that we all seek. In a position of utter desolation, when man cannot express himself in positive action, when his only achievement may consist in enduring his sufferings in the right way, in the honorable way. In such a position, man can, through loving contemplation of the image he carries of his beloved, achieve fulfillment. For the first time in my life, I was able to understand the meanings of the world. The angels are lost in perpetual contemplation of an infinite glory. All that was happening to him in a concentration camp. No mystic, no avatar in history has had a deeper insight than that insight about the reality of love, and the efficacy of love through a contemplation of the beloved. And all through the day, my mind, he says, still clung to the image of my wife. A thought crossed my mind. I didn't even know if she was alive. I knew only one thing, which I have learned well by now. Love goes very far beyond the physical person of the beloved. Love finds its deepest meaning in our spiritual beings, our inner self. Whether or not he is actually present, whether or not he is still alive at all, ceases somehow to be important in the presence of love. So his contemplation of his wife, he didn't even know if she existed, whether she was even still alive. But that didn't make it less real, because the reality, deeper than his wife, was the presence of the beloved, was the presence of love. What an extraordinary thought. This intensification of the inner life, says Frankl, help the prisoner find a refuge from the emptiness, the desolation, and spiritual poverty of his existence in the camps. By letting him escape into the past. And as the inner life of the prisoner tended to become more intense, he also experienced the beauty of art and nature as never before. You know, when you're in love, the sky is bluer, everything tastes better. That's why they say love is blind, right? Because in the presence of love, when one has fallen into love, one has a intensification of thought and word and deed, such that even if the context is arduous, as it is in a concentration camp, you sort of forget about it, because your interior life spills, as it were, through your cells and fills everything in your reality. That's the power of love. That's the power of meaning in our lives. Another time he says we were at work in a trench. The dawn was gray around us. I sensed my spirit piercing through the enveloping gloom. I felt all of a sudden my spirit transcend that hopeless, meaningless world. And from somewhere I heard a victorious yes in answer to my question of the existence of an ultimate purpose. We don't understand what's going on in the world. We say, what's going on? Can there be any purpose? In Auschwitz, that question goes deeper to an ultimate existential level. He was pondering, can there be any ultimate purpose in what is happening here? At that moment, a light was lit in a distant farmhouse, which stood on the horizon as if painted there. In the midst of the miserable gray of a dawning morning in Bavaria, a light shone in the darkness. For hours, I stood hacking at the icy ground. The guard passed by, insulting me. And once again, I communed with my beloved. More and more, I felt that she was present, that she was with me. I had the feeling that I was able to touch her, able to stretch out my hand and grasp hers. The feeling was very strong. She was there. Then at that very moment, a bird flew down silently and perched just in front of me on the heap of soil which I had dug up from the ditch and looked steadily at me. Nature felt his epiphany, and nature communicated solidarity. So we had this kind of issue that he was, becoming more and more alive, but all around him, people were just trapped in the suffering, in the carnage of the camp. People were committing suicide. People were being shot. People were being gassed. People were doing that. But he realized that his interior life was getting more and more intense. And just finally on this point, generally speaking, of course, he says, any pursuit of art was somewhat grotesque. I would say that the real impression made by anything connected with art and nature and love arose only from the ghost-like contrast between the performance and the background of a desolate camp life. I shall never forget how I awoke from the deep sleep of exhaustion on my second night in Auschwitz. I was roused by music. The senior warden of the hut had some kind of celebration in his room, which was near the entrance of the hut. Tipsy voices bawled some hackneyed tune. Suddenly there was silence. And into the night, a violin sang a desperately sad tango, an unusual tune not spoiled by frequent playing. Just a violin played. An unusual tune not spoiled by frequent playing. That's exquisite. The violin wept, and part of me wept with it. And on that same day, someone had a 24th birthday. That someone lay in another part of Auschwitz, possibly only a few hundred or thousand yards away, and yet completely out of my reach. That someone was my wife. Someone was my wife. Love is the fountainhead of meaning in the end. That's what Viktor Frankl discovered in Auschwitz. The next point I want to make before we open it up for comments and questions is later on in his book where he talks about the question of whether a person has a choice or not in the context of circumstances. And he says the experiences of camp life do show that a man does have a choice of action. Man can preserve a vestige of spiritual freedom, of independence of mind, even in such terrible conditions of psychic and physical stress. He makes a beautiful line. Everything, he says, can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. The sort of person the prisoner became, in fact, says Frankl, was the result of the inner decisions that they made, not a result of the cap conditions alone. And this is at the heart of the Stoics. And I want to bring them in here for just a moment, because this is not an original idea of Frankl's. The ancient Stoics in Greece and in Rome, Mediterranean world from about the 4th century to the 2nd, 3rd century AD, had as their cardinal principle that most of what happens in our life is beyond our control. We suffer because we don't understand them. We don't like the weather. We don't like how our bodies turned out. We don't like this. We don't like that. And the Stoics said, that's not your concern. That's fate. That's life. There's only one area where you have ultimate power, and none other. And that is how you respond to what happens to you. Because it is your response that is the only place where human beings have ultimate sovereignty. And if you think about that, that's pretty close to fundamentally true. I can't control the Ukraine. I can't control the pandemic. I can't control the weather. I can't even control what people think of me. But I can control how I respond to what happens to me. And that was an insight by Frankl that I think is quite profound. And it was articulated and developed while he was in Auschwitz, where most of the people were saying, I have no blame, and they weren't sure how to respond. He quotes Dostoevsky, who said, there is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my suffering. An active life serves the purpose of giving man the opportunity to realize values and creative work, while a passive life of enjoyment affords him the opportunity to obtain fulfillment and experience in beauty, art, or nature. But there's also a purpose in that life which is almost barren of both creativity and enjoyment, and which admits but of one possibility of high moral behavior, namely, in our attitude to our existence, and existence restricted by external forces. A creative life and a life of enjoyment are banned to him. But not only creativeness and enjoyment are meaningful. If there is a meaning in life at all, then there must be a meaning in suffering. Suffering is an ineradicable part of life, even as fate and death. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. And then he tells the story of a young woman that he knew there in Auschwitz. The young woman knew that she was going to die in the next few days. But when I talked with her, she was cheerful in spite of this knowledge. I am grateful that fate has hit me so hard, she said. In my former life, I was spoiled and did not take spiritual accomplishments seriously. And then pointing through the window of the hut, she said, this tree here is the only friend I have in my loneliness. And through that window, she could see just one branch of a chestnut tree. And on that branch were two blossoms. I often talked to the tree, she said. I was startled and didn't quite know how to take her words. Was she delirious? Did she have occasional hallucinations? I asked her if the tree replied. Oh, yes, she said. What did he say? What did it say to you? She answered. It said to me, I am here. I am here. I am life. I am eternal life. So once again, when we open ourselves up to meaning, when we open ourselves up to love, to a deeper spiritual stratum, all of nature is open to us and expresses its comfort, whatever we are forced to endure. And that's why people love their dogs and love their pets. They don't care who you are, what you look like. They just want to be your friend. That's nature, the friendliness, in all of our multiplicity of experiences. And then just finally here, he quotes from Nietzsche. He who has a why can bear almost any how. That's at the heart of logotherapy. That's at the heart of man's search for meaning. As Nietzsche said, anyone who has a how, has a why, can endure almost any how. Whenever there was an opportunity for it, one had to give them a why and aim for their lives in order to strengthen them to bear the terrible how of their existence. Woe to him who saw no more sense in his life, no aim, no purpose, and therefore no point in carrying on. He was soon lost. So what Frankl is pointing out here is not academic to any of us. It's our interior life that makes the difference of our health and well-being and survivability and viability in the world. The typical reply which such a man rejected all encouraging arguments was, I have nothing to expect from life anymore. What sort of answer can one give to that in Auschwitz? What can we expect from life anymore? And then his great insight. We had to learn ourselves. And furthermore, we had to teach the despairing around us that it didn't really matter what we expected from life. What matters is what life expects from us. And to me, this may be the most profound line of the entire book. It doesn't matter what we expect from life. What matters is what life expects from us. Life ultimately means taking the responsibility to find the right answer to its problems and to fulfill the tasks which it constantly sets for each individual. Questions about the meaning of life can never be answered by sweeping statements. Life does not mean something vague, but something very real and concrete, just as life's tasks are also very real and concrete. Every situation is distinguished by its uniqueness, and there is always only one answer to the problem posed by the situation at hand. Now, this is fundamental because, as he points out, in Auschwitz, asking about the meaning of life was an absurdity. Just a complete and utter absurdity. But once the meaning of suffering had been revealed to us, we refused to minimize or alleviate the camps tortured by ignoring them or harboring false illusions and entertaining artificial optimism or undue despair. Suffering then became a task on which we did not want to turn our backs because they understood it was the key to the meaning that would give them the power to survive the suffering. It's a fundamental point. That, as he says, it's not what we expect from life. It's what life expects from us. That's the key. And just turning that around empowers our sense of agency. Empowers our sense of agency. Our tears, he said, our tears bore witness that a man had the greatest courage, the courage to suffer. And just to conclude, since he was a specialist in suicide in an early age of depression, he said, I remember two cases of would-be suicide, which bore a striking similarity to each other. Both men had talked of their intentions to commit suicide. Both used the typical argument they had nothing more to expect from life. In both cases, it was a question of getting them to realize that life was still expecting something from them. Something in the future was expected of them. We found, in fact, that for one, it was his child whom he adored and who was waiting for him in a foreign country. For the other, it was a thing, not a person. This man was a scientist and had written a series of books which still needed to be finished. His work could not be done by anyone else, and more than any other person could ever, and more than another person could ever take the place of the father of his child's affections. This uniqueness and singleness, which distinguishes each individual and gives a meaning to his existence, has a bearing on creative work as much as it does on human life. This is very profound. You know, often in spirituality, you know, we listen to the Dalai Lama and we read the words of Jesus and we have this kind of grandiose sense of life and ultimate meaning and cosmic love. And we get lost in these platitudes and words and concepts and philosophies. And Viktor Frankl says none of that amounts to a hill of beans. It's all irrelevant. Every life is particular. Every life is unique. For one of the men, it was the child that he knew was still back home. Cling to that. Allow that to give you meaning and purpose and future, even in Auschwitz. For another, it was a scientific inquiry that nobody else had discovered, and only he could deliver out into the world. Cling to it, said Frankl. That's what's uniquely you. And that's at the heart of logotherapy, which we'll get to next time. That every life is specific. There are no generalities. There's only the way each individual, within the context of his or her own circumstances, works and acts and relates and suffers. And if out of that uniqueness that each one of us has, we are able to connect with our beloved, whoever or whatever that is, and no longer think that life has to justify itself to us, but rather we need to justify ourselves to life. Then, says Frank, not only does meaning begin to permeate everything, including your suffering, but you become empowered by love, and you become healthier, even in a death camp, because you've learned the most fundamental truth that any of us can ever learn on this earth during our time. And that is that love is the final presence, that if we can touch it and allow it to subsume us, our lives are transformed. And meaning is gain that allows us to endure anything that life may cast our way.
All I can say is that was a lot to reflect on. And thanks to Kat, who does such an incredible job capturing conversation. I want to deeply thank you for doing the transcription of that journey into man's search for meaning. I'm just going to see, Thomas, if you are there near your video to come on. I'm just checking to see if you are by your computer or not. I'm just going to wait and see. If not, then hi, Thomas.
Hello, Leslie.
So, one of the things I'm aware of is time zone changes when the North America shifts and then Europe comes a couple of weeks later. And so apologies for that warped time zone reality that we faced this morning.
No, my sincere apologies. I should check that. I'm just so used to have this Humanity Rising session at 5 p.m. French time that I made this mistake today.
Well, we're going to definitely want to have you come back in for a longer dialogue, but can you spend the next 20 minutes with us, just, in concert of the body of work that you've done, which is so comprehensive. I was reading your book last night, and I just, all of the textures and layers by which you go into the politics of being. Maybe we could just start from that perspective, what's your reflection of what Jim was sharing around man's search for meaning?
I have to confess that I arrived very late, so did not hear maybe so much or enough to really approach that from the perspective of the politics of being. There are a lot of sentences, beautiful sentences by Jim that was resonating with my work, but maybe I'm not sure I can offer this kind of general thoughts about that. I was particularly moved by when he said, it's not about what you have to expect from life, but what life expects from you. So that I found particularly inspiring, and this book I talk about these new politics which would prioritize being, how we can build it and how we can implement it, how we with very concrete public policies in many sectors, and what I hear from what I heard from Jim today, as I arrived very late, was more like for me on what I touched in my last chapter on leadership and how the importance of being in service and this inner connection and the connection to the life of your nations, for political leaders, or for organizations, for corporate leaders, for example, And when we are really in touch with that and really in a spirit of service, then we can really be guided to help deliver the kind of transformation that are knocking at the inner life of nations, of organizations, and and help really realize these evolutionary potentials that are enough ripe to manifest.
You know, I just want to now bear with me in the convolution of my mind for a moment as I pondered this question I want to ask you. So as I was, just before I was reading this particular area around policy and how do we start to introduce this this politic of being into policy, I had been listening, as you would have been, to the news coming out of the Ukraine, and then I had been listening to net zero and the fact that the consumer is actually driving the oil and gas purchasing, and the complexity of Germany having to decide its fuel source from Russia. So, I mean, we've got this war, we've got oil and gas at a high pitch. It's increased in terms of its usage significantly over the last year. So instead of going down, it's gone up, and including our emissions. So war is triggering more of that. And we have a call to action by the Ukraine to step in and do something significant that then will affect the lives of Germany and other parts of Europe if they do what they're being asked to do. These are complicated questions to ask of a public. So how do you introduce the politics of being into this type of environment?
Thank you, Leslie. No, that's a complex question. You know, first, I would say that politics of being is really about also, above all, I would say, trying to enter in a process of conscious evolution where we can really making use of the science that I've developed over the last decades and reflect on our culture, on where we are, and try to see how we can build the culture we want to live in. And a particular important aspect of that is a culture of peace. This is a concept that have already some history. There have been UN resolutions and program, and frankly, you know, it's possible to tell how we can build a culture of peace, and indeed some countries are much more advanced than other in that part. And some of the policy recommendations that I propose in this book in different sectors build on that work of a culture of peace, of what Ryan Eisler also called a culture of partnership, in opposition to a culture of domination, in which, you know, the whole Putin politics is very much rooted in, as well as, by the way, the Trump politics. So culture of partnership, a culture of peace, what does that mean? Well, we know that we spend a huge amount of money in supposedly protecting us from each other, and there are some a lot of pressure from lobbies also for that. So just very briefly, you know, the way we raise children, the way we take care of babies when they are newborn. I often say that there is in Sweden you have 18 months of parental leaves. In the US, there is no federal leave policy. That makes a huge difference on how individuals can develop, you know, if they can benefit from the love of their moms and dad and presence. It makes a huge difference in their own development, their potential for flourishing, but also how they can contribute positively to society. So that's why also it makes sense for societies to step in. the whole culture of peace is a culture also free from oppressions, whether they are cultural, gender, economic. So all these, the need for equality in all these domains, and having a justice system that is more restorative than just retributive. So just the point is that we know how to make that happen. And for example, Nordic countries have been very much advanced in that direction. Maybe I come back a little bit to your. I think it's very. And there I speak as a European. For many people, it's very troubling, to see what is happening now in Ukraine. And I know some people that are that just left Ukraine recently, and so sorry, I lost a little bit what I wanted to say, but
well, maybe could I come into this?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I get it. Yeah. So I think to me, it really points, as you say, there is some economic consequences about how we decide to react in Europe, and it seems like we are being okay to pay some prices to be able to show a strong, at least economic reactions to what Putin is doing in Ukraine. So I think to me it goes really to the point about a politics of being is proposed as an alternative to a politics of being really focused on economic growth. So there we also have to what is more important, or values or savings accounts, right, or bank accounts. So that's the one thing. Having said that, we need also to be careful about how we manage, I believe, economic sanctions, etc. So that's a larger debate. Yeah.
So I'm just okay. So just in these last few moments, I'm thinking about this in the sense of you put forward an interesting example of how governance can be done in a way in which we involve a different form of ways in which people show up in terms of their voice. And so I run a scenario of Germany realizes that it needs to fundamentally shift its use of oil and gas in order to not be dependent on Russia. And it does two things. It takes out economic, payment to Russia, and it affects net zero. So it's a double whammy benefit on this other world, right? What would be, and I'm just using Germany because it's one that has a very significant relationship in oil and gas with the Ukraine, with Russia. What would be the governing framework that you would suggest to bring Germans into that recognition and into a collective state of agreement around how to move forward?
It's a complicated complex question. Just to say that I'm not sure even if it will be indeed double benefits, because I think I've heard also about the need maybe to use coal instead of gas, which would make higher greenhouse gas emissions. Also, in terms of governing frameworks, and there is also the nuclear that France, because it has a strong nuclear industry, is trying to promote as a green form of energy and recognized as such in the European Union. So it's a very complicated matter, even with Russians now threatening the existing nuclear installations in Ukraine. So we can also wonder, if really nuclear is the right solution in that context. In terms of governing framework, I'm not exactly sure what you mean on that. I can highlight that in France we had a very interesting process a citizen assembly for or transition to a low carbon economy. And we had basically the state picked up randomly some citizens and asked them to propose concrete actions, laws, policies to help our country make this transition. They did a beautiful work, and it's a subject that politicians have been struggling with for years and have never been ambitious. And you really pick random people. They are the people. They don't have a specific bias for ecology or whatever. And they come up, they look at the problem, they interview experts, they think together, and they come with the most ambitious roadmap we have ever seen in France. So that shows how much the governance or form of democratic governance really controlled by political parties, lobbies, etc., is just not working. And that there are new forms of governance, and I'll highlight many of these initiatives in my chapter on governance, that we can tap into to make democracy really work well again. And also highlighting that democracy is in crisis, but it's more about how it works and its ineffectiveness, but not the value of being associated to decision making. This we can see in social ecological surveys that this is rising everywhere. So it's not like democracy is a problem, it's a way or adversarial or competitive democracy works.
So can you give one of the examples that you used in that chapter? Because I think they're seminal in illustrating that it's not that democracy is the issue. It's how we politicize, polarize, all kinds of ISES in how we approach it. But there was an example. I'm trying to recall the exact example, but I looked at it and went, that was a really interesting methodology that was used.
Well, there are different examples, and I can share also a little bit more about the general philosophy, which really explicit my methodology of bringing wisdom and science together later. Maybe that's of your interest. Some example, I think, of citizens' assembly, I think are a great example. I've mentioned about climate change in France, but there is this example in Ireland where they did the same process to discuss abortion. And that's a huge, very difficult subject in Ireland when you know the importance of religion, etc. And what was incredible is that through this process, they were able to distinguish, and disentangle, all the things that people see behind this agenda to come to a reasonable legal text that was finally adopted. And that really shows you how our public conversation is really organized, and our political deliberation are really organized in a way that makes wiser decision difficult to achieve. And the power of these other kind of methods, like citizens' assemblies, can be really surprisingly effective to help us tackle some of our important challenges. I mentioned also maybe how in the digital democracy in Taiwan and
yes.
the use of social media platforms, we could say, to support a more effective deliberation and public participation in governmental decisions making. And they did also achieve a lot of, they were able to draft and passed a legal text on a number of issues through this process. And what I found really inspiring is that it really also exemplify one of my major points with the politics of being, is that our institutions should be designed in a way that waters the best seeds in everyone, that helps everyone cultivate the best of ourselves. And we see that social media in general are really designed in a very just for the opposite, right? They are priming or more polarization or being outrageous, etc., etc. And they say, like in Taiwan with this platform, on the contrary, the algorithm were designed to prime zoos that were searching for consensus, etc. So we can really, completely use this algorithm to promote not the worst of human characters, but really the qualities that we want to cultivate in society.
You're so right about algorithms around collaboration and consensus are just the same as paradigms in our head, right? In terms of how we search for insight or opinion in ourselves, we have these algorithms. And so part of what the politics of being is about, how do we reestablish, transform algorithms, both internally and externally, to build a different kind of connectivity. So I want to tee this up for when you come back next time, but let me know, why did you call it The Politics of Being?
Sure.
How did you come to that title?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've been told that's a great title. I think I wanted also to convey something that people can easily grasp, not something very philosophical. If we really want, and I believe, and that's what I've worked 10 years on this book, that I believe that we need this as our new development paradigm, and it has to be more and more adopted in the coming decades. And that's so. And for that, I needed to propose a concept that everybody could agree on, at least everybody who share what I believe is part of the same story and has very different names, and I list them in the book. So people talking about system change, living systems, happiness, empathy, compassion, culture of peace, mindfulness. At the end, it's all about being. And so I research what people coming from this wisdom-based approach to politics or development I've said and I've agreed on. And I found this sentence in the Earth Charter that was an important document written 20 years ago, which went through a lot of consultations. And it says, when basic needs have been met, development is about being more rather than having more. So I've seen, all of this, as I said, behind all of the many things that people are promoting with under different name, I feel like there is being. I can say also that I've been inspired by Edgar Morin, which
Yes.
is who is a French philosopher. So he's now 102 years old, I think, I believe now, and still alive. He has received a lot of honorary doctorate. He's very famous in France, Latin America, not so much in the English-speaking world. And he has wrote a couple of books. One, his name is Introduction to the Politics of Man, I think he called it. And he talked then about a politics of civilization, a politics of the human, not sure how you translate in English. So I had this also in the back of my mind when I go, well, it's about, politics of being.
Well, it's interesting because when I'm an anthropologist, and so when we look at politics, we identify it in the third chakra, which is the place of I am. And so, we've socialized that is significantly in different directions. And so what I think your work has done is brought it back into its original essence, and does it in a comprehensive, there's so many avenues of others inside of this work, and then you hold it in the space for us to see it in its holism, and then for us to understand where do we see ourselves in that holism. So I want to thank you for your great work. I can't wait for you to come back on, and we'll definitely be in the same time zone world buddy then in terms of time. So thanks so much for being with us today, Thomas. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Leslie. My pleasure. And sorry again for arriving late.
Yeah, we
Looking
just get to
forward
have
for
you
the next
again. Terrific. So just to let everyone know that thank you for all joining us and being part of our experience today. We've taken some different roadways, and it's always interesting when you don't know which roadway you're going to be on and you discover I was on the right one all along. So tomorrow we have Jack Healy, who goes by the name of Mr. Human Rights. So as a female, I am going to be interested to listen to this, that when somebody can claim Mr. Human Rights in a world where women's rights are very far from being equal. But then that's just my commentary for today. So thank you very much, everyone. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Hug a tree. Be you. Bye.